Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many turning out so early in the morning, and great to see the mix of people that are here. The League of Women Voters, as you know, is an organization that's political but nonpartisan. And our mission is to get people to vote. That's it. We need to have people vote, but we also need to have them educated, and we need to advocate for the issues that are important to our country. This is one of the things that's obviously critically important. And I'm so happy that our Natural Resources Committee has been able to organize these excellent forums over the past several years. We are also interested in advocating for better government, for education, and other issues that come up. In fact, higher education was the subject of the most recent study of all of the leagues in California. So I'd just like to welcome you this morning, and I hope that this will be another in the really excellent series of natural resources forums that we've sponsored. Thank you.
Thank you, Marge. By the way, I assume everyone in the room is registered to vote, but just in case you aren't, we do have voter registration forms at the sign-in sheet. And we also need to let you know that you can now register on your smartphone. You just go to Smart Voter, it's called registertovote.ca for California.gov. registertovote.ca.gov. If you've moved recently, you may need to change your address. And please make sure we got an exciting year of elections coming up. I'd also point out that we have evaluation forms. There should be one on every seat. We very much like your feedback as to what you like and don't like, and there's a place if you have suggestions for either speakers or topics for next year. Feel free to give us that and leave them at the sign-in table when you leave. If you have to leave early, please leave your evaluation form. I'd now like to introduce our host here from Neighborhood Church, our environmental group at this church, Suzette Horspool.
Thank you, Rhodey, and welcome everybody. I'm Suzette Horspool with the Green Council here at Neighborhood Church. We are happy to be co-sponsoring this League of Women Voters Climate Change Forum for the third time in a row, second time actually located here at the church. We are an organization that is set up to focus on the Unitarian Universalist seventh principle, which is respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And as such, we have three main thrusts to our group. One is to green the campus and help its congregants green their own homes and lives. One is to keep an eye on environmentally related legislation, and through that concept, we helped birth the Pasadena chapter of the Climate Change Lobby. And the third one is to extend activities into the community by taking part in rallies, helping set up school gardens, and co-sponsoring events like this with our sister organizations in the community. Again, I would like to welcome you to Neighborhood Church and to the League of Women Voters 5th Climate Change Forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzette. I'd like to just point out that we have one of our favorite politicians here this morning, Anthony Portantino, if you want to stand up in the back. He's running for state senate in the district where Carol Liu is currently serving. In addition to Neighborhood Church, we have 8 different co-sponsors for this event, and they helped with suggesting ideas for topics and speakers. They also helped us rank order and select the 3 speakers that we have today. and they also brought food. So we want to thank our co-sponsors. I'll just mention their names. We have the Arroyos and Foothills Conservancy. If any of you belong to that group, would you raise your hand? I gave them a little money myself. We have the Arroyo Interfaith Environmental Coalition with Tom Brady and others from All Saints. I think Suzette is a member of that as well. The Arroyo Seco Foundation. I belong to most of these groups myself. Citizens Climate Lobby. Ooh, look at that, a whole bunch of you guys. Climate Resolve, Jonathan Porphyry and people downtown. Eden from All Saints, there's Tom. Okay, and Sierra Club, how about Sierra Club? Very good. And Transition Pasadena, Therese. Okay, thank you all. And we have a nice turnout here. There are, for those of you who are standing in the back, there are several seats up here in the front 2 or 3 rows, so you can all sit down. I don't think you're going to have to stand through all of this. What I'd like to do now is, well, first of all, the restrooms, if you need them during the break, just go out this door and right around the corner. And there's one for you, Joe. Yeah. And the restrooms are there. And I told you about the evaluation form. We have 3 excellent speakers that we went through quite an elaborate process to select. Each speaker has been asked to talk 30 minutes, and then we're going to have 10 minutes of Q&A after each one. And Peter here is going to be the timer. He'll let you know when you have a minute left and more or less when to stop. We'll give you a little leeway. We're not going to cut you off mid-sentence. And then we're going to have Q&A, and we'd like you to line up in the center aisle behind that microphone, kind of first come, first serve, for questions or comments. And we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A after each speaker. And then we'll take a short break and get some more food and check out the tables out there. Okay, our first speaker is John Odell. And let me check my thing here. Where did John Odell go? Okay. John is got his doctorate in political science at University of Wisconsin, and then he began teaching and research at Harvard, and then moved to USC in 1982. He recently retired from USC and is now a senior fellow for a think tank called the Center for International Governance Innovation, which is based in Canada. And he and that organization have commissioned a series of short works with fresh ideas to improve the global governance of climate. So, and he was a participant in the Paris climate talks back in December. So he's going to give us the world view of what happened in Paris. John?
Thank you, Rhodey. It's an honor to participate in this distinguished forum that's been going on for 5 years. And it was also a privilege to be able to be in Paris. I was there because of the think tank that I work with, and because we'd published these series of short papers during the year. I was pleased to notice in Paris that the ideas recommended in 2 of these papers did appear in Paris. You notice I didn't say that the papers caused them to appear in Paris, but we think we may have had a small effect about it. I'd like to summarize what I have to say in 3 main points this morning. Number 1, as we know, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change finally did reach agreement on a new historic agreement that is a new type of agreement that covers all members. Second, the pledges that the member states made, if implemented, will help reach the goals of the agreement, but they're not enough. And third, and the reason I call this the Paris outcome is, for me, it means more than the UN agreement. I also saw a huge groundswell of activity by other international organizations, governments, and the private sector also moving us in the right direction. So, point number one, finally, after 17 years of annual meetings and reaching stalemates, they did finally reach an agreement. It didn't happen until the last day, Saturday, the 12th, and when I got there at the beginning of the second week, they were still fighting over the text on key issues, and it seemed like the biggest one was going to be how much financing did developing countries get out of this deal, and it seemed to me that it was possible they were going to produce another stalemate, but they did manage to reach an agreement. What is in the Paris Agreement? Okay, there are 4 goals that I would highlight. And the entire world, 195 members of the UN have agreed that their collective goals are to stop global warming well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts, these words were negotiated very carefully, to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 C. This was a key demand of the low-lying islands, small island states, and the most vulnerable, least developed countries. Second, and this was new in the Paris Agreement, a goal of achieving emissions neutrality in the second half of this century. Third, also new, established the goal of increasing the ability to adapt to climate change that's already occurring. This was a red line for the African group of countries. And 4, finance for the developing countries is one of the common goals. So how did they agree to meet these goals? Well, this is where it was a different type of agreement. As you know, the Kyoto Agreement, signed in 1997, was a universal, legally binding agreement that handed out obligations to cut emissions to all the countries, applying initially only to the industrialized countries. A top-down agreement, they like to call it in the climate talks. And this was to be consistent with the science, and it made sense if it were carried out. Unfortunately, the problem was not enough countries signed up to participate. Most notably, the United States and China refused to be members. And so today, the Kyoto Protocol covers only about 13% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And the Paris Agreement effectively is going to replace the Kyoto Agreement. This time, they agreed finally to give up on the idea of universal obligations, and instead, the agreement says that each country shall pledge a unilateral pledge to make some contribution to help solve this problem. So the obligations are voluntary. They're nationally determined. The term in the agreement is nationally determined contributions. But everybody is obliged to make some nationally determined contribution to help solve this problem. They agreed that they shall make another pledge every 5 years, and that it shall be better than their current practice at that time. This agreement has no termination date. It's designed not to have to be renegotiated. This 5-year process is intended to help improve the pledges. It does include some top-down elements. Each country is obliged to report its own emissions and its efforts to reduce them periodically, and they've agreed that they will have a global stock taking every 5 years to assess how they're doing in light of the science. And the first of those will be in 2023. The pledges under the Paris Agreement refer to the period from 2020 to 2030, or 2025 in the case of the U.S. pledge. So they don't take effect until 2020. And this is building on the Kyoto Agreement, which was supposed to be in effect until now. There are no material penalties for non-compliance in the Paris Agreement. The hope of the advocates is that this 5-year process of reviewing publicly and collectively will create peer pressure and help encourage governments to ratchet up their contributions. Their reports, each government's reports, will be scrutinized by an expert committee appointed by the United Nations, and the committee will be authorized to recommend that the country make improvements. All of this in public. Okay, so That's the only compliance mechanism really in the Paris Agreement. Second point, they did make pledges, and they will help, the initial pledges, but they're not enough. 187 countries came forward and made pledges, and John Kerry said at the end of this meeting, we thought if we got 100 countries, we'd be delighted, and he was more than delighted. And so this agreement covers the United States and China for the first time in a UN climate agreement, and virtually all of the world's emissions, and even South Sudan and Afghanistan, torn by war, managed to come up with something to pledge. So what will be the effect of these initial pledges? A number of non-governmental research institutes with climate models tried to estimate the answer to that question. They put all the pledges together and converted them into common metrics and projected what would happen to global emissions and global temperature if they were all implemented between 2020 and 2030. This is one of those from a group called Climate Interactive with several folks whose PhDs are from MIT. You can see across the bottom the years out till 2100, and on the vertical axis on the right side is the average global temperature in 2100. The blue line shows what would happen if there were no pledges and nothing was done to change beyond what governments are doing today. Somewhere between 4 and 5 degrees centigrade, global warming above pre-industrial levels. This would be beyond catastrophic. And the pledges, according to this outfit, if implemented, would reduce that to 3.5 degrees centigrade. Now, each of these forecasts is actually forecasting a range of possible temperatures in that year in which they say the actual number is highly likely to fall, and what we have here on the chart is the median number in the range. So this is an improvement. This is better than 4.5, but far above the target of 2.0 or well below. Now this model, this particular projection, assumes that the governments implement their pledges for that one decade and then stop these efforts to reduce emissions, because that's all they've pledged so far. But they also ask what happens if we do get some ratcheting up of contributions, and they came up with several other possible answers. 3.2 if the governments do that, but then keep on doing the same mitigation effort out till 2100. 3.0 if all of that plus China adds other greenhouse gases besides CO2 from energy to its pledge and reduces emissions after they peak by 2% per year. China's pledge is to peak its emissions in 2030. Or 2.6 if all of that plus all developing countries also peak by 2035, it's 20 years from now. Or even 2.0 if all countries peak and then reduce by 3.5% per year, which is pretty ambitious. There were several other projections from other organizations, but I think this gives us a pretty good idea of the general consequences of the initial pledges. They were every country, virtually every country, pledged something, and they are helpful but not enough. To give us a little more global context on where our own country stands in fighting climate change, the way the rest of the world looks at it, they often ask, which countries are responsible for the largest accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere historically? Because it's the accumulation of the CO2 that's capturing the heat and causing the global warming, and the CO2 in particular will be up there for centuries and centuries and centuries. Okay, you see from the chart that good old USA is the leading polluter in the world historically with 27% of total accumulations historically. This is as of 2011. You notice where China is, 11%. Not anywhere close in 2011. Now they are trying to catch up. Because if you look at annual new emissions, China surpassed us in 2007, and this was 2011. But you notice that we're still number 2 in the world with new additional emissions of carbon pollution going up into the air. Number 3 is European Community, 28 countries, who are the real pioneers in trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. India, number 4, and when people look at that, they say, well, yeah, and India is this great big country with these billion people. They've got to be cutting their emissions, right? They're a big part of the problem. Well, when you talk to the Indians, they want to talk about emissions per person, right? So if you take the total emissions of greenhouse gases in the world and divide by the total world population, the average per person is about, what is that, 6 or 7? Well, you can't see it. It's white. Why did they do that? Put a white bar on a chart with a white background. But anyway, the world average is about 6. And look at India. Per person, emissions, about 2 tons per year, per person. Now look at China. China's emissions per person are about the same as those of Europe and Japan, 6, 7, 8 tons per person per year. More than India, because they're more developed. But even though China is enormous, its emissions per capita are about the same today as those of Europe. And look at the United States. Ooh, 19 tons per person per year. So when our politicians tell the Indians, you guys have got to cut your emissions, steam comes out their ears. You see, they talk about development emissions and luxury emissions. That's their term for it. In case you're curious, what did the United States pledge in the Paris Agreement? There it is. You can read it. It's a summary. It is an economy-wide target. It does cover all greenhouse gas emissions. They agreed that the developed countries all should make pledges that cover their entire economy, all sectors. And most developing countries did not make pledges of that type, that comprehensive. India did not, for example. Their pledge is to increase the deployment of solar energy dramatically, and several other things. China pledged to expand its forestry, its forests. They did pick the year 2005, that Washington did, as a reference point for cutting emissions, which makes it easier to reach, because the European reference point is 1990 levels of emissions. Ours went up between 1990 and 2005. And I do believe they were counting on the Clean Power Plan concerning the electricity sector to reach this 28%. Okay, summing up points 1 and 2, I personally wish the UN agreement had been stronger, especially as regards financial aid for the developing countries. I believe they basically got rolled on that point. They got words, no numbers. It's not legally it's not enforceable with sanctions anyway. But I would add that the United Nations has, I would say, made significant contributions to this problem. And we need to remember that it's not a world government, and I don't think any country would want it to be a world government. I mean, the UN means Vladimir Putin and Assad and North Korea and so forth, right? But look at what the UN has contributed. They created the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which every 5 or 6 years has been summarizing the science and has made a huge contribution to improving an understanding of the reality, the scientific facts, all over the world. The UN have agreed together, and I think of the UN as a they as much as an it. They have agreed to establish common goals for us all to work toward, agreed that every nation now should make some contribution to reaching them, to publicly assess and collectively assess their performance, and that the rich should make financial contributions to the poor. I believe this agreement has much greater chance of success than the Kyoto Agreement did, and I believe this is the most we can probably get from the United Nations. But, and my third point is, the UN is not the only organization we have to depend on here. And that's the other thing that I saw in Paris, the point number 3, a huge groundswell of activity by other organizations and states already underway mostly before there was a Paris Agreement. Let me give you a few examples in the time that I have left. Several other groups of smaller numbers of countries, smaller than 195, have formed to help solve this problem. Here's one example. The International Solar Alliance, established or proposed by India and France, and one of our papers had suggested this idea. And the idea is that India provides a secretariat for this alliance and the first 5 years worth of funding. It's designed to overcome a market imperfection in the deployment of current solar technology in the tropical countries. There are lots of areas with lots of sun which lack capital and technology, and there are potential businesses in the small cities in India and Africa that could be joint venture partners with big companies that have capital or pension funds even, but they don't connect with each other. They don't know who they are. So this alliance would bring them together. It would create training centers for the technicians for these companies and model codes of regulation for the countries to deploy. India has a small industry that has been creating and setting up solar off the grid in rural areas that have no electricity at all. There's 1 million people in India that have no electricity at all. And so this is one example of a group of countries. Another one, a different set of 20 countries, call themselves the Mission Innovation. These countries, including the United States, agreed to double their public investment in R&D innovation over the next 5 years. We will need still better technologies in the future. And together with the countries, there was a coalition of 28 major private investors. And that's why in between Barack Obama and Justin Trudeau, you have Bill Gates standing there. He was the headline leader of this coalition of investors, which also includes Mark Zuckerberg and Richard Branson and Jack Ma of India and a bunch of venture capitalists. This group has pledged to take innovations from these 20 countries, research, and make patient investments to get them through the valley of death of innovation, building the first factories, getting experience, getting the costs down, and then selling them off, the successful ones, to ordinary investors. The International Monetary Fund is one of the biggest and most established international organizations in the world, and you know them as being the home of orthodox economic policy, budget cutting, and inflation fighting, and so forth. But look at what the managing director of the IMF has said recently. Says climate change is by far the greatest economic challenge facing the world in the 20th century. It's not just an environmental challenge, guys, she says. It's an economic challenge. Our world economy and our businesses are going to be suffering, and already are, from climate change unless we take action. And the IMF has been using its staff to campaign with governments to reduce their subsidies to fossil fuels. World's governments are subsidizing fossil fuels to the extent of $600 billion a year, compared with $100 billion a year as subsidies for renewables. When you're in a hole, what are we supposed to do? Stop digging, right? And the IMF says, look, these are bad for government deficits, subsidies, and they're bad for the climate. So let's stop them. Across the street from the IMF is the World Bank, which has another enormous staff, and they've been using some of their staff to campaign for carbon pricing. They're very concerned about the effect of climate change on development, on developing countries, their clients, and they're helping train those governments on how to establish carbon pricing. I won't go through lots more, but I'll just give you a quick list of other established international institutions that are working on climate change. The UN Environment Program, the UN Center on Climate, on Technology Transfer and Networking, the International Energy Agency, the International Renewable Energy Agency, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Food and Agriculture Organization. All of these have staffs. They're working to develop policy ideas and advocate for them on climate change, besides the UN. Speaking of carbon pricing, 38 countries already have carbon pricing in the world, and 23 other jurisdictions, including California. And so big multinational corporations headquartered in, say, the United States, they operate in Europe. They're operating under carbon pricing already. Keep that in mind in a minute. And notice that China is on that list. They started a series of 6 or 7 pilot projects in regions and cities of China to experiment with emissions trading systems. And in September, when President Xi Jinping was in Washington, he announced from the White House that China was going to establish a nationwide emission trading system starting in 2017. And of course, President Obama could not say, yes, and we will too, because he doesn't have the legislative authority. China has done more about climate change, not air pollution now, but climate change itself than most Americans realize. They built more solar capacity than we have, more wind capacity than any country in the world. And China's chief fuel has been coal for years. It was 80% a decade ago. And their coal consumption actually fell in 2014, and it fell again in 2015, and it's due to fall again this year. It's partly because the economy is slowing down, but they have decided that their strategy of economic development is not sustainable. And they've been committing now to an emissions trading system as well. This is Mayor Parks Tao of the city of Johannesburg, South Africa. Also in Paris, I attended this meeting hosted by an organization called the C40. This is a set of huge world cities. Started out as 40, there are about 80 of them now. His city won 2 awards this last year for its innovative steps toward addressing climate mitigation and adaptation. This organization, since 2009, has taken over 10,000 climate actions, and the cities have pledged to reduce their CO2 emissions by 3 gigatons by 2030. This is all before the Paris Agreement, right? The cities are working on this. Also in Paris, the mayor had a big meeting downtown in the city hall of 1,000 local leaders. Eric Garcetti spoke to that meeting. I also attended this presentation of a report about what financial regulators around the world are doing to fight climate change. Now this sounds boring, I guess, but think about it. Reaching net zero emissions in the world is going to require trillions of dollars of new investment, infrastructure and everything else. And governments are never going to have all the money to make that investment. A lot of that money is going to have to come from private investment. And there will be trillions of dollars of investment. It comes with economic growth. It's part of economic growth, but it's not always been efficient with respect to sustainable development. And financial regulators are one of the people that have tools that can direct that flow one way or another. And they have not been very green up to now. But this report spent 2 years, found 100 examples in 40 countries of financial regulators who are already mainstreaming climate change or mainstreaming sustainable development into financial regulation. For example, the Central Bank of Brazil was the first banking regulator in the world to require its banks to report on the environmental risks in their business. The Central Bank of Bangladesh requires banks in its country to allocate a certain fraction of their loans to green projects. Now, they are on the front lines of climate change and facing serious risk of inundation. And the leaders in all of this financial stuff have been in the developing countries. The Federal Reserve is lagging behind in this respect. But the Bank of England is different. Mark Carney made a rather startling speech in September in London, at Lloyd's of London, where he announced that insurance companies and investors, other investors, and even whole financial systems may be at risk from climate change. Economic risk. I mean, after all, if the oil does end up having to stay in the ground, the price of the shares of BP depend on the value of those resources in the ground. If the value of the resources in the ground goes down, what happens to the value of the stock? What happens to the insurance companies and the pension funds that own this stock? The Bank of England is thinking about this, and this is not Greenpeace, right? This is the Bank of England This is mainstream. And when regulators think about this and talk about this, investors tend to listen. They have to think about it. And groups of investors are moving on climate change. I've just picked two to put up here of others. 118 investors so far have signed up to the Montreal Carbon Pledge, starting in 2014 before the Paris Agreement. They've all pledged $10 trillion under management to publish the carbon footprints of their portfolios and to work with the companies that they own to try to get them to reduce their emissions. By the way, CalPERS and the University of California have signed this pledge. Then a smaller group has pledged actually to decarbonize $600 billion worth of assets, and more are signing on to this coalition. And did you know, by the way, that the Rockefeller Brothers Fund in New York has pledged to decarbonize its investment portfolio? Yes, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. They said, we believe that John D. the first would agree with us today. These are not the best investments to be invested in. And so when investors are starting to ask questions from the companies that they own, their boards of directors have to listen. And this is happening all around the world. In Brazil and various board meetings are being held to discuss this. Bigger corporations are enlarging their sustainability offices to report on the carbon risk that the investors are asking about. Up to 1,000 companies now worldwide are using an internal carbon price in making project investment decisions in case more governments besides the 38 should also decide to require to put a price on carbon. This is a sample of the 81 U.S. famous big companies which all signed a pledge last year saying we want a strong Paris Agreement on climate change, and they made pledges to further take new steps to reduce their own emissions, or in the case of the banks, to increase financing for green projects. And notice down at the lower right-hand end is Walmart. Very conservative, famously conservative company, right? They've been putting solar panels on the roofs of those buildings. Since 2005, they pledged to try to go all renewable for their energy. They're spending their money to do this. They apparently think there's a good business case for it. There is evidence that the train is leaving the station. So to summarize the three main big points, the UN finally did reach a global agreement, a new type that covers every step, every nation, and they are making concrete pledges to solve the problem. The first pledges are not enough. They're going to have to improve them. But the UN is not the only institution. Many others are already acting, including the vital private sector. Now, Rhodey asked me to add an epilogue in light of some recent events, and I was tempted actually to add 3 epilogues if I have time, because some exciting, interesting things have been happening. And this is since the Paris Agreement. This week, number 1, the International Energy Agency made its annual report on global emissions of CO2 from energy. This is the big gorilla. It's not all greenhouse gas emissions, but it's the big gorilla. And the news is that they didn't rise in 2015. They also didn't rise in 2014. They've been flat for 3 years, and this is while the world economy has been growing. This is good news, because it shows us that the world is learning how to decouple economic growth from fossil fuels, from carbon pollution. The IEA pointed to 2 main causes for this trend. They said there have been improvements in energy efficiency in the world economy, and big improvements, increases in deployments of renewables. In fact, they said that 90% of the new electricity plants built in the world this last year were renewables. Then, just 6 days after the Paris Agreement was signed, the Congress passed the omnibus spending bill. You might have missed it. It was in the run-up to Christmas, and the big headline was that they decided not to shut down the government again, which is a good thing. But also inside the bill, the U.S. Congress, yes, that Congress, took 3 new measures to improve U.S. climate policy. First, they extended the subsidies for wind and solar, which were going to expire, for 4 and 5 years respectively. The deal, they went back to making deals. The deal was the Republican Party got a lifting of the ban on oil exports, which the oil companies have been after for years. But the analysts say this is a serious net win for climate. We're going to save a lot more emissions with the deployment of renewables than we're going to increase with oil exports. I'm not sure how much oil they're going to export in the future. Second, they enacted higher standards for reconstruction in flood zones after coastal flooding, which is functional for the goal of adaptation to climate change. And they appropriated the first $500 million of a U.S. pledge to the Green Climate Fund. President Obama pledged $3 billion eventually, which is achieving the goal of helping the developing countries with financing. So don't forget that. Then, on the 8th of February, surprisingly, the U.S. Supreme Court, by a 5-4 vote, stayed the Clean Power Plan, on which I think they were depending to achieve that 28% cut. This was not a decision on the merits of the complaints. They're deferring the implementation until the Court of Appeals rules, which will probably be in the fall. The complaints brought by a set of 25 states led by West Virginia and Texas. And on the other side, the other 25 states and several cities have filed friend of the court briefs defending the Clean Power Plan's legal soundness, including California and including the city of Houston, by the way, going up against Austin. The EPA has been challenged in court many times since 1970 of clean air regulations, and they have quite a good record for winning these court challenges. I don't know how the judges are going to rule in this case, and as you know, a few days later, Justice Scalia died. He was one of the 5. We'll have to see. This probably will end up back in the Supreme Court. If the Clean Power Plan goes down, what happens to the Paris Agreement? Well, my guess is, first place, China is doing what it's doing because it's in its national interest. And in fact, its ambassador said last year that we will continue doing what we're doing even if there is no Paris Agreement. Also, we know that the U.S. electricity business is moving toward renewables anyway, and Congress renewed the subsidies, which can encourage that. But even in my opinion, if the Clean Power Plan is upheld, it's not enough, and it's way too late. We've lost a whole generation. In my opinion, we need a national legislation to put a rising price on all carbon pollution, including transportation, industry, agriculture, and the rest. But it's hopeless, right? You've heard all the presidential debate and so forth. Well, if I could just finish up a few more little tidbits of fact, which are also true. One, I was in Washington in June with the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a nonpartisan organization also, and I was in one Republican office where we were talking to a very conservative Republican member, talking to his staff. We laid out our plan and consistent with Republican values and so forth. He gave us all the reasons why it would be so difficult for us to do anything about this, etc. But we were packing up to leave. He said, quote, "We do know we have to do something about this," unquote. That's one tidbit. Okay. Then in September, the week before the Pope spoke to the Congress, a group of 11 Republican House members, current politicians, publicly introduced a new resolution in the Congress saying the Congress needs to do something serious about climate change. This took some courage. This was not the leadership of their party. And then in October, 4 Republican senators also came out with a similar statement. Then in December, we had the entire world agreeing in Paris. And then in January, the Republican congressman who represents Key West, Florida, and a Democratic congressman from Florida announced the formation of a joint bipartisan climate solutions caucus in the House. They think they're going to get all 13 signers of the Gibson resolution, and they've agreed to a Noah's Ark rule so that a Democrat can join only if he joins with a Republican. So that they keep it but otherwise it wouldn't be bipartisan. It's only a caucus, but this is how things get started. So, is it hopeless? Well, I would just add that surveys show that the American public is ready for serious climate action. 2/3, 65-64%, are saying they're concerned about climate change, they believe it's human-caused, and they favor a revenue-neutral carbon tax with the revenue returned to the American people. So the public is not the problem. And remember, the man refused to give women the right to vote for years and years and years, until they changed their minds. Remember, it used to be legal to smoke in public places for years and years and years, until our governments decided to listen to the science. And remember that it was illegal for gays to marry for years and years and years, until the country flipped. And I don't know how long it's going to take, but I think the Congress is going to flip on this issue too. Thank you.
Okay, if you have any comments or questions, please line up at the microphone. Carol, yes.
Hello. So you said that there were two things in the agreement that the think tank brought to Paris. What were they? Did you say what they were?
Thank you.
That was very good, by the way.
Two
Thank you.
suggestions from our group. One was this solar alliance that I mentioned. The other paper was about the process of negotiation. It was a series of tips on how to manage a complex multilateral negotiation where there's a lot of dissensus and get agreement out of it. And that author was consulted by the French, and the French did a masterful job of bringing consensus out of dissensus. Of course, they knew how to do that without our paper, but we thought it might help.
Great job. Thank you.
Yeah, that was really interesting, John. The 38 or 28 countries that have a carbon pricing mechanism in place, are any of those the carbon fee and dividend that the CCL favors? Or are they more the type that we have here in California with tradable where you can trade back and forth and sell and buy contracts sort of for carbon?
Most of them are cap and trade systems. Sweden enacted a carbon tax in 1991, and it's up to 150 euros per household now, or per ton and per households. But in most countries, it's cap and trade, and I think that's because for politicians, it's more attractive. They get to hand out the initial allowances to the industries that will otherwise block passage of the law. They could auction them off, which is better, but if you're facing strong opposition, they like to be able to hand out something to get it started. I imagine that's the main reason. China is using a cap and trade system, which is very laborious to set up and administer, but there it is.
So you mentioned the Gibson Amendment, which is an important breakthrough. I just wanted to add that the Friends Committee on National Legislation brought some junior high school kids to meet with Congressman Gibson, and they had an enormous influence.
Wonderful.
And I bring that up because I often go to offices of congressional officials, and whenever I can, I bring kids with me. They attract the interest and open up the hearts of our elected officials and their staff. So it's a good technique to use.
We should try it too. In fact, Congressman Corbello of Florida, who is the second signer of the resolution and the organizer of this bipartisan coalition, was also invited. A high school, an elementary school teacher, somebody had all of her students write letters to him, and then they invited him to go to the school, and he agreed, and he went to the school, and he got 200 letters from this school, and then he went back and he wrote answers back to all 200 of them. So, good idea.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. I'm here as part of the Pachamama Alliance, which is in support of CCL and the carbon fee and dividend. And we have a public seminar that covers in a workshop fashion the kinds of issues that we're faced with that is environmental sustainability, social justice, and spiritual fulfillment as all needing to be moved. That there is a parallel between the developed and undeveloped countries where we have a decision to make. Are we going to support the underdeveloped countries so that they join with us rather than create multiple migrations in the future as things get terrible? And are we going to bring the less advantaged American citizens along with us in this and not create a barrier to change? There's a seminar that will be happening on April 23rd. I'd be glad to talk to people about it.
April 23rd?
April 23rd.
And where?
At the Immaculate Heart High School. I have flyers in the back and would love to invite people to that.
Great work. Thank you for doing it.
I have a very quick question. There's a sort of a plan B for all this, which would be using technology to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. I know it's difficult, but we don't know in the long run whether it's more difficult than plan A. R&D takes a long time to happen. Was there any discussion at Paris about the developed countries joining together in a research program to take CO2 out of the atmosphere?
I don't know of any such discussion in Paris among governments. At the meetings I've attended, including in Lima the previous year, there have been panel discussions, certainly, on carbon capture and storage, where the advocates are making presentations to encourage it. But I don't think there's an official discussion about it in Paris.